I'm talking today about Steinbeck of Mice and Men, and I'm talking about the second section, which is where we're introduced to the bunkhouse and George and Lenny meet an assembly of characters that are going to become very significant as the story unfolds. So in the first section of the story, we've met George and Lenny, two guys who are migrant workers travelling from ranch to ranch picking up work, living a kind of life on the breadline and on the edges of society. They're not men with families, they're not men with homes of their own, and so we've seen that all they really want is to buy their own place, to buy their own farm, patch of land, settle down, have their own chickens, be self-sufficient, and basically achieve the American dream. But there's going to be issues with that, and the first clue to that is the title of the novel, of Mice and Men, which is from a Robert Burns poem, which talks about the plans of mice and men going awry, as in failing. And so often with plans that people make, things happen, unforeseen circumstances that mean we just can't achieve them. And in the climate that Steinbeck set this story in, the climate of the Great Depression, the 1930s in America, that's true of a lot of people. A lot of people have got dreams and are just unable to actually realise them. Now, George and Lenny are different from a lot of migrant workers in that they have each other as friends. But we quickly see in the first part of the book that it's not really an equal friendship, in terms of Lenny thinks and acts much like a child. George is the one with the brains. George is the one who's the parent in the relationship, who has to basically look after Lenny. He's obviously got some kind of learning disability. He thinks very simply about things, and we learn that Lenny has a habit of getting into trouble, and so George has to bail him out and they have to leave wherever they were. So with that background in mind, we get to the bunkhouse in section 2, and immediately we get a real window of insight into the lives of migrant workers in the 1930s. It says the bunkhouse was a long rectangular building. Inside, the walls were whitewashed and the floor unpainted. In 3 walls there were small square windows, in the 4th a solid door with a wooden latch. Against the walls were 8 bunks, 5 of them made up with blankets, the other 3 showing their burlap ticking. Over each bunk there was nailed an apple box, with the opening forward so it made 2 shelves for the personal belongings of the occupant of the bunk. These shelves were loaded with little articles, soap and talcum powder, razors, and those Western magazines ranchmen love to read and scoff at and secretly believe. Now, what immediately strikes us is that it's a really basic setup here. So the ranches needed workers, and so they would have this big bunkhouse, a bit like a youth hostel, where the men would just come, grab a bunk, stay as long as the work was there, and then they would move on. During their stay, they're living in this communal dormitory. They would be eating together in a canteen with food provided by the boss. And all they've got really is a bed and an apple box nailed to the wall. So it's not even really like a proper shelf or anything. And all the kind of belongings that they have are really small items like soap and razors, toiletries, really basic stuff here. None of these guys have got much to hold and call their own. There's hardly anything personal. Such as, really personal items that mean anything. And so often, because these guys are travelling from ranch to ranch, everything they've got is in the bindle on their back, as it were. They can't carry much with them anyway. But it just shows the kind of bare bones lifestyle of a ranch worker. And that is why things like dreams become so significant to these guys, because it's all they've got to hold on to in this really stripped back life. And it says, in the middle of the room stood a big square table littered with playing cards. Around it were grouped boxes for the players to sit on. So if you can imagine, these guys are working a long day out in the fields. They come in, they get their dinner in the canteen. They go back to the bunkhouse and they play cards. That's their life. They have very limited entertainment. They have very limited relationships with others. It is a really bare bones lifestyle, and in fact there's not an awful lot of difference between this and, say, being in a prison, is there really? Now, as soon as we're in the bunkhouse, we're introduced to a number of different characters. The first one is Candy, and Candy is an older man. He has lost one of his hands. So he's got this kind of disability, and he's been kept on to kind of push the broom around and keep the place tidy. And he seems a really friendly character towards George and Lenny, and he tries to calm George down, because George gets really angry when he finds a kind of lice killing powder, and he thinks, oh, you know, there's obviously lice in this place, and Candy calms him down and kind of wins him over. Candy also introduces another character whose name is Crooks, and Crooks is a black man who's employed as a stable buck. He actually lives in a separate part of the ranch. He has a room of his own, and he keeps books in his room, it tells us. He reads a lot, got books in his room. He's called Crooks because he's got a crooked back where a horse kicked him. So Crooks is a kind of double outsider figure, firstly because of his skin colour, and secondly because of his injury and disability as well. Now the boss comes in, we meet the boss, and he kind of feels a bit suspicious about George and Lenny because Lenny doesn't say anything. The reason Lenny doesn't say anything is because George has told him not to say anything. George knows that Lenny's going to give himself away, that he's not very clever. So the boss begins to think, oh, is George trying to steal Lenny's money? Which of course is really ironic because George has looked after Lenny now for a long time. But what's good is that the boss gives them a chance anyway, and even though he doesn't seem very happy about it, he leaves it. Then we meet Curley, who is the boss's son, and the thing with Curley is that he is instantly a very aggressive guy. He glanced coldly at George and then at Lenny. His arms gradually bent at the elbows and his hands closed into fists. He stiffened and went into a slight crouch. His glance was at once calculating and pugnacious. Now instantly Curley looks at Lenny and sizes him up. Curley's a small guy, but apparently he likes fighting, and he sizes Lenny up immediately and starts to get into an aggressive position. Now, by being the boss's son, Curley's got this kind of privileged position on the ranch, and he's kind of using it to throw his own weight around. And he instantly tries to get Lenny to talk, and of course Lenny's still trying not to talk. And George instantly senses that Curley is just going to pick a fight with Lenny for no reason. Curley gets defensive even when George tries to speak for Lenny. And he says, and you won't let the big guy talk, is that it? He can talk if he wants to tell you anything. He nodded slightly to Lenny. We just come in, said Lenny softly. Curley stared levelly at him. Well, next time you answer when you spoke to. George asks Candy what's wrong with Curley. And Candy said, Curley's like a lot of little guys. He hates big guys. He's all the time picking scraps with big guys, kind of like he's mad at him because he ain't a big guy. And so George is really worried now that if something happens between Curley and Lenny, obviously it's going to go wrong. Lenny's really strong. Something could happen and it would result in them having to leave the job again. George says, Lenny ain't no fighter, but Lenny's strong and quick, and Lenny don't know no rules. That's going to be significant later on, because this is the whole point with Lenny, is he doesn't have the agency or understanding to make these decisions for himself. Now, having been introduced to Curley, we're then introduced via Candy again in dialogue to Curley's wife. And what he says is, she got the eye, which means that, you know, even though she's married to Curley, she's constantly looking around at the other guys on the ranch. Candy says, I think Curley's married a tart. And having had this introduction, we then meet Curley's wife, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit on this section here. It says, both men glanced up, for the rectangle of sunshine in the doorway was cut off. A girl was standing there looking in. She had full rouged lips and wide-spaced eyes heavily made up. Her fingernails were red. Her hair hung in little roll clusters like sausages. She wore a cotton house dress and red mules, on the insteps of which were little bouquets of red ostrich feathers. Now, I love the fact that Curley's wife appears blocking the light. It's kind of symbolic for the fact that she's going to bring trouble, she's going to bring danger, and that's also symbolised in the colour red used for her fingernails and her mules and the ostrich feathers. Now, Curley's wife is never given a name, another significant point in the story, because in a sense she has no real individual identity here. She's a young girl who's just got married, and she's quickly discovered that marriage isn't what she thought it would be. She's stuck on her own in a ranch full of men. She's got no friends, she is away from her own family, and she's quickly discovering that Curley isn't a very nice guy. So Curley's wife is constantly plagued with loneliness and being on the outside of everything. So she's constantly trying to find human contact through the ranch hands. But obviously they're all really suspicious of her because she's the boss's son's wife and they don't want to get into any trouble. So she kind of goes around the ranch saying that she's looking for Curley. Really, she's actually just looking for some human conversation and some attention. Now, the fact that she wants attention is also shown in the use of the colour red, which is very much a kind of look at me, ostentatious colour. The fact that she's heavily made up, again, it shouts for attention and it suggests vanity on her part. The fact that she's got bouquets of ostrich feathers on the mules shows a kind of ridiculous kind of fashion for someone living on a ranch. I mean, this isn't Hollywood. This is just a dirty, dusty ranch, and she's going around wearing high heels, painted fingernails, just looking a bit ridiculous. But the kind of sad thing about it is that she's trying to emulate film stars, glamorous film stars of the day. She had a dream once that she wanted to be in the pictures, which we're going to find out later. And so she's someone who's desperately trying to be someone that she isn't. She is trying to cover up the fact that she's probably just quite a plain, ordinary girl with the kind of makeup and the kind of dramatic things that she's wearing. But the fact is she's looking for drama, and on a ranch that means looking for trouble. George instantly senses this, and you can see the tension in this introduction between Lenny, who is clearly, gobsmacked at the appearance of Curley's wife and her attraction, her trying to respond to George and Lenny and suss them out, get a reaction from them, and George, who instantly sees her as a red flag. Oh no, something's going to go wrong here. Lenny's had trouble with girls before. We know back in Weeds he was trying to touch a girl's dress and got in trouble for that. And so George instantly tries to shut the conversation down. "I'm looking for Curley," she said. Her voice had a nasal, brittle quality. George looked away from her, then back. "He was in here a minute ago, but he went." "Oh." She put her hands behind her back and leaned against the doorframe so that her body was thrown forward. "You're the new fellas that just come, ain't ya?" "Yeah." Lenny's eyes moved down over her body, and though she did not seem to be looking at Lenny, she bridled a little. She looked at her fingernails. "Sometimes Curley's in here," she explained. So in her flirtatious behaviour and her actions, Curley's wife's clearly looking for attention from George and Lenny. George is determined not to give her the attention and keeps looking away, shutting down the conversation. But unfortunately, Lenny doesn't really know it much better than to just stare at her, completely bewildered and hypnotised in a sense by the sight of this girl. I mean, you've got to remember that the guys were moving from ranch to ranch. They didn't get much contact with girls. George said brusquely, "Well, he ain't now." "If he ain't, I guess I'd better look someplace else," she said playfully. Lenny watched her, fascinated. George said, "If I see him, I'll pass the word you was looking for him." She smiled archly and twitched her body. "Nobody can't blame a person for looking," she said. So the sense here is that George is already really worried now that she's just going to be trouble. He calls her a tramp and said, "So that's what Curley picks for a wife." "She's purty," said Lenny, defensively. "Yeah, and she's sure hiding it," George says it ironically. He says, "I don't care what she says and what she does. I seen 'em poison before, but I never seen no piece of jailbait worse than her. You leave her be." And in calling her jailbait, George is seeing Curley's wife as this kind of femme fatale, a kind of dangerous woman figure who's going to be a temptation to someone like Lenny. And if he does anything with her, he's going to get into huge trouble. So in that extract, what we can see is Curley's wife is longing for attention, really wanting to be attractive to others, but is a real source of worry for George because she's dangerous. And this is going to foreshadow the way in the story she is going to be one of the main reasons why everything goes wrong, why the plans of the mice and the men go awry.
Hit subscribe if you'd like to follow my vlog for more updates on teaching, reading and studying.